Hi, in this video I am going to try to show you how you can use literary terms to analyze fiction. Now, literary terms are not just fancy words that you can use to impress your teacher, but they are tools that you can use to analyze and interpret any work of fiction. So I'm going to illustrate this by using these terms that you can see here on a comic book called Gumballs, written by Aaron Nation. Now, this is a comic book that consists of around 160 pages, so I'm not going to analyze the whole thing, but it's a comic book with a lot of episodes, short stories that are autobiographical, about Aaron Nation's journey as a trans man. So there are episodes from his childhood and growing up, starting on testosterone and so on. The book also has fictional stories of characters that he has invented, but I'm going to focus on a few of the stories/episodes from his own life that he talks about in the story. And as I said, I'm going to try to use these literary terms to analyze the text. Now, the first thing I would like to comment on is characterization. Now, we have both direct and indirect characterization, but since this is a comic, it's different than what it would have been if it had been just a word, so a regular like short story or novel. Because when we have visual information, there's necessarily more direct characterization than there has to be in a short story or a novel. So if you just use words, you can choose like how much direct characterization and indirect characterization you want. But when you choose comics, you necessarily have to have quite a bit of direct characterization because you have to draw the characters, and that gives us a lot of information and details about their looks, their appearances, and their body language, obviously, but it also necessarily gives us information about the setting. So all these things are shown directly, so that through direct characterization. So for example, here in this short story about what it feels like 7 months on testosterone, so he sort of draws these challenges, so we can see a lot about his visual appearances. You see in this episode, he has chosen to not include a lot of information about setting. Here you see that this background is mostly just white or pink or gray, so he's sort of dropped showing us the setting. In this story, on the other hand, we get very much information about the setting. You can see that the pictures are quite detailed. So we get a lot of information about the grocery store where he has worked directly through the images. The interesting thing about the drawing style of this author is that he's drawn a very detailed background here, but the images of the people, they're quite sort of simplistic, and it can be a bit hard to actually read the body language because, you know, how are these characters feeling? Are they happy, upset, sad? You see sort of like that it seems like a smile, and this one, the mouth is sort of slightly downward, but does that mean that she's unhappy or not? So because they are so simple, the facial expressions don't really provide that much information, even though that it's sort of directly shown to us. So even though there's a lot of direct characterization, because we see what they look like, what they're wearing, and so on, there's also a lot of indirect characterization because we have to interpret their facial expressions, their body language, and that is indirect characterization. We also we see their lines, what they say, and then we can also interpret that and what does this tell us about the characters. But in addition to the images, which show us what the characters look like and sort of the dialogue between the characters, there's also a lot of written work here. There are a lot of words, and there's a lot of direct characterization here as well. We have a first-person narrator, so he does sort of tell us about his story here. And here, for example, we can look at this picture, look at his facial expression. He seemed kind of upset, And then he also says, go to hell. So that, of course, is indirect characterization, because I have to interpret that okay, I'll interpret that he's cranky, or yeah. So, but I'm not allowed to interpret that completely on my own, because as you can see here, he says directly, if something annoys me, I get pissy. I'll be upset without a reason. So this is direct characterization in combination with indirect characterization, but the direct characterization circumscribes how I can interpret the indirect characterization. So I'm not free to interpret this scene any way I like. I'm told here specifically how to interpret this. Now, to talk a little bit more about the main character, Aaron Nations. He's the main character, or the protagonist of the story, and I would call him both a round and a dynamic character. So if I talk about round character first, now round means that you have emotional depth, that you appear to be a real life human being, because you have positive sides and negative sides, and we also often learn something of their background story. So throughout this comic book, we definitely see different sides to Aaron. For example, here is a fairly sort of negative side, where his co-worker just asks him politely if he can write an order, and he just replies, go to hell. Here is another example where he talks about how he's feeling depressed, and why he's feeling depressed, and you know, what he does to cope with it. And here are some negative coping mechanisms. But then we also see that he has found some better ways to cope with his depression and his gender dysphoria. So we see many different sides of him. We see him in different situations. We learn about his background sort of story, because the earliest episodes are from his childhood when he was a girl, and the last episodes are from sort of now, when he has turned into the man that he has always felt like he was. So therefore he's a round character. We see many sides, and he's also a very dynamic character, obviously, because he goes from being a girl. You can see here, this is on page 6, so very early in the book, that he is a girl, and he's talking about how he became aware of his gender and how it felt wrong. And you see here already that being a girl sort of leads to exclusion from a group that he wants to be a part of. And then you see him towards the end of the book, and here he sort of also shows visually his sort of transformation from a woman into a man after several months on testosterone and so on. So he physically changes. He changes gender, which is really significant. But also he's also dynamic, not just because of the physical change, but because of his mental change. Throughout the text, we see how he sort of learns new coping mechanisms, how to sort of cope with different situations, and he grows mentally from the internal conflicts that he struggles with, and sort of gets to be more comfortable with who he is, both his body and sort of his mental health. Now, because it's a personal story, it's autobiographical, and it's told through a first-person narrator, it of course becomes a very personal account of this journey that he's on. Now, throughout the text as a whole, there are also stories about fictional characters, and here he uses a third-person narrator. So the book as a whole has multiple narrators and shows different perspectives, but the stories about Aaron are written, as I said, in a first-person narrator with a limited point of view, because we only see sort of things from his side. It's his voice that is used in the story. he is the protagonist, as I've already said. There isn't one clear antagonist in the story. There are many different people who sort of display negative qualities, so many minor characters. For example, here, you know, do you want to see my sweaty balls? So there are a lot of different characters. They often represent either transphobic ideas or, in general, sexist ideas. So you might say that an antagonist might be not just one person, but the norms that society presents for what you should accept or what you should be like when you are a woman, and also what it means to sort of belong to the different genders. So society, in a way, might be seen as an antagonist because they sort of present him with these norms and ideas that he doesn't really feel fit. And also maybe even his own body might be seen as an antagonist because he does fight his own body. It feels wrong to him. He wants to be a man, but he was born into a female story. Some of the stories in the text have sort of a clear antagonist. For example, this story here about from his childhood again, where these boys invite him to play, and he thinks, oh great, I'm going to be one of the boys. But what they do is that they pin him up against a tree and lift his skirt. So in this sort of individual stories, there could be clear antagonists. But again, these guys just represent sexist ideas and, ideas about how men can do what they want to women because a woman is, the weaker sex. So I think these boys are just representatives of a larger conflict. Now, this story is a concrete example of an external conflict here between Erin and this group of boys, but as part of the story is about his journey and accepting himself and sort of his internal struggles, there's also clearly many internal conflicts in the story. This is a good example of an internal conflict. There's also kind of an external conflict because his co-worker says some things that he finds offensive about Bruce or Jenner or Caitlyn Jenner, a transgendered woman who has sort of gone the other way than Erin, from a man to a woman. And then, his co-worker talks about how he makes an ugly woman, and, he says it's just weird. So there is, in a way, an external conflict between them without this character being aware of it. But for Erin, this is mostly an internal conflict because he doesn't say anything when his co-worker says these things, and then he feels really depressed about not speaking up, and he talks about why he doesn't speak up, because, for example, he says you're a coward to himself. You're afraid your co-workers will figure you out if you stand up for another trans person, and that is also an internal conflict that he has throughout the story. Should I tell the world that I'm trans? Should I tell my co-workers or not? And of course, he's afraid of the consequences of being open about his background. So that's a good example of an internal conflict that we see throughout the story. Now, the last couple of literary terms I want to use are motive and theme. Now, motive can be a bit difficult for many students. So a motive is something that is used throughout the text. It has symbolic meaning, and it can also often help you to sort of deduce the theme. What's the theme of the story? But here in this text, for example, the toilet is a motive. You'll see several scenes of him in the toilet. So here it's about his body changing, and the smell of his urine changes. And then there is a whole episode about why it's so difficult for him to choose which toilet to use and the consequences of going either to the women's bathroom or the men's bathroom. So again, the toilet or the bathroom becomes a motive throughout the story with symbolic value, because again, it's about him changing and not knowing which toilet to use. becomes sort of, you know, who am I? And am I now a man? Am I accepted as a man by society? And all these different issues that he struggles with that are part of the theme. So as you can see, these terms can be very useful when it comes to analyzing and interpreting fiction.